himself, as did Micaiah in 1 Kings 22 and Isaiah chapter 6, as a witness to the proceedings of God's heavenly counsel. This idea came from the growing understanding and conviction in Israel that Yahweh is the supreme God before whom all others must bow. Our psalmist conveys that all gods are lesser gods and that the one true God will judge them all. It is Yahweh who possesses all the nations, not the pagan gods whom the heathen bow down to. They exist only insofar as the Lord permits them, and that will not be for long. The gods and rulers of other nations have botched things so badly that their end is fast approaching. And just how does Yahweh judge the gods and rulers of this world? The Holy One asks each of them a question in verse 2. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? And then a command is made in verses 3 and 4. Give justice to the weak and the orphan, maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. This strange, unseen God, called Yahweh or Elohim, is very different. Very different than the so-called gods of the ancient world. And their kings and their princes, very different. There is no altar before this God, which is visible. This Holy One is not known so much simply by power and prestige. No. This God is known by his demands for justice, for the weak, for the powerless. The needy. This is not a God who favors the powerful, the status quo, and those who are on top. Just the opposite. This is the Creator who demands that the most insignificant among us are not written off or left behind. This is the character and personality of the God of Israel, the God of Jesus Christ. Justice is the emphasis. The Almighty reeks of it, demands it, calls all those who claim to be followers to be formed and shaped by it. Justice. Throughout the scripture, the prophets speak to us of this theme over and over and over again, like a broken record. They make religious authorities, as well as ordinary people, very uncomfortable. When we look to scripture for some comforting spirituality, they end up bringing us into the hard nitty-gritty of the world. When we turn to the Bible for some sweetness and light, we instead get a sermon about widows and orphans, about corruption of judges and affairs of the marketplace. Instead of showing us elegant beauty, the prophets take us to the slums. The world is a proud place full of beauty. But the prophets are scandalized and rave as if the whole world were a slum. They make much ado about what many consider a trifling subject, a judge that lies, a child who won't get food or health care, or an education because they were born on the wrong side of the border. Things that horrify the prophets are even now daily occurrences all over the world and even in our own country. Prophets never preach a watered down justice and only rarely a gentle justice. For them, justice is passionate, it's tempestuous, it's hot-headed, and most of all, immediately necessary. They speak a powerful no to all that destroys, and they live with all their might lives that refuse to compromise with injustice. They refuse to let false words and false actions slip by without comment and without resistance. Authentic spirituality has to include works that serve justice. There is no such thing as authentic spirituality without justice. We can have the most deep and abiding relationship with Jesus, but it will come to nothing unless we bear the fruits of justice. This is not justice as imagined as a blindfolded figure arbitrarily trying to balance a set of scales. No. This is a fiery, prophetic, unrelenting justice urged on us by a God of justice who demands not only that we preach it, but that we do it. You know, going back to when we were children, most of us thought that justice came into being of its own accord. That virtue was its own reward, that good would triumph over evil. In short, that justice would occur automatically. Today, I think that almost all of us would agree that there really is no machinery, not on this earth at least, which causes justice to occur automatically. People have to make it occur. Otherwise, it doesn't come into existence. It's always hard because justice presents a threat to power, and in order to make justice come into being, you often have to fight power. But they are still, and the world resists that. When you fight power, yet we're still called to resist. You may be saying, a preacher, that sounds worldly, political, or getting involved with things we shouldn't get involved with. Now that's just what those who are in power want you to think. If you listen to any president of the United States, of either party, power is a word he never uses and discusses directly in relationship to us. Senators and congressmen never use that word either. It gets people thinking. Who knows where your thinking might take you if you don't talk about power. It's like not lifting the hood on your automobile. You don't know how the doggone thing works. But in a democracy, it is a deadly thing not to know how it works. Particularly if you're concerned about justice. And that's what the Bible is concerned about. From Genesis to Revelation. The Bible does not allow us to be neutral in situations of injustice. If you try to maintain neutrality, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has his foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you are neutral, then don't be surprised if that mouse hates you for it. So we stand around saying, I don't understand why the world seems to hate us. Yet we know little about other nations, and even less about their history and our history with them. If all you know about the world is a 30-second news spot on some complex issue that is paid for by some corporate interest with a reporter who is afraid to lose their job if they seem unpatriotic, well, you're not going to know much about the world. Unconsciously, that may be the way we want it. Who wants to have to work to learn things that make you feel uncomfortable and then challenge you to change? But that is exactly what God is calling Christ's followers to do. Verse 5 says, they have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk around in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaking. Despite sticking our heads in the sand, the injustices of the world don't go away. And thinking it doesn't really affect me is one sure way to be found wanting at the judgment of God. But even before then, we begin to see the shaking of the foundation. Even before it. People worried about how the market will do on Monday after years of rampant greed with little to no oversight on mortgages. You remember that little event? How so many houses were underwater when it was through. How the mortgage industry wasn't watched, not carefully. We even today wonder, well, why is it nobody works anymore? I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, people are just lazy, they just don't want to work anymore. Maybe inadequate pay, and suddenly we can't find enough workers has finally caught up with us. Maybe a generation has paused, maybe partly because of the coronavirus, we don't know, and said, man, life is short. I don't want to spend 8 hours a day doing something that has no meaning for me. Before we shame them, we need to listen to them. When a country goes through a fruitless, unending war that has bled us fiscally and literally without end for over 20 years, and we don't even pause to think about, what do we get for that? Over 95% of people in prison are in prison because of drugs or drug-related crimes with little to no recovery programs available in this country. Very few in our prisons are jammed with folks who are there somehow, one way or the other, because it's related to drugs. Infrastructures that's beginning to fall apart after years of neglect and pretending that politicians that promise us no new taxes won't have any negative long-term effects on our country. And who got all those new tax breaks? I'm beginning to hear the shaking of the foundation, and the cracks are becoming visible. The Almighty doesn't have to come down with a fiery sword of judgment. All the Lord has to do is sit back and let us bring down the consequences of our actions on our own heads. So what then? What then is the follower of Christ called to do? I want to suggest there are basically four things. First, we need to begin by grieving. Grieving our own hard-heartedness and our failure to live and act differently in an unjust world. To sense our own failure to come out and be separate, to be true sons and daughters of the living God, who become a light in the darkness rather than add to the darkness. And second, we need to start by recognizing that we are just passing through. Instead of the things we cling to and the dreams we often fashion, we are to recognize this is a short trip. And as we get older, we recognize that more and more. We are passing through. So what are we going to be leaving to others? How will we bless the world or curse the world? Leave it more lit or more dark? To recognize that this world is not simply to be used for our agenda, but is what we are leaving our children. Our children. And finally, fourth, to see in every face, every human face, our brother and our sister. Jesus was all about that. He was all about that. That every time we meet a stranger, that every time we meet our so-called enemy, in their face, there we see a brother or sister. That we are to come to grips with the fact that we are to respond differently than the world. If we do these four things, we will see where it leads in our life. And I believe God will bless us in ways that we cannot comprehend and understand. And God will use your simple life, your simple words, your simple deeds to change the world. You throw a pebble into a pond and you see the ripples. We cannot see the ripples on this side, brothers and sisters. But those ripples are happening. And all we can do is be faithful with our opportunity to make ripples happen that reflect the love of God and the justice of God. And if we're faithful to do this, we can say with the psalmist, "Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations belong